One of the most common questions I hear from non-native English speakers is, why can I read and write well in English, but when it's time to speak, I freeze. I don't know what to say. I can't find the words. And today, I'm going to talk about that in this video. But before I can answer that question, you first need to understand the difference between active and passive vocabulary. Active vocabulary is made up of words that you understand when you read and hear them, and at the same time, you use them when you speak and write. So there's input and there's output. Passive vocabulary, on the other hand, are words that you can understand when you hear and read them, but you don't use when you speak and write. So there's only input, but you can't make an output out of them. To illustrate this, just imagine a sea of words. At the very top are your active vocabulary, and at the bottom and in the middle are your passive vocabulary. For example, your active vocabulary are bad, walk, come, push, use, and under these active words are passive vocabulary. You understand them, but you don't use them when you're speaking and writing. And that's what makes them passive. Active vocabulary tend to be generic, while passive vocabulary tend to be specific. For example, the word walk. Walk is quite a generic word, but if you want it to be more specific and with emotion, you can say saunter. Saunter is more specific because it means to walk in a slow and relaxed manner without hurry or effort. So it feels like when you say saunter, it feels like the one doing the walking is in a good mood. Another example is the word bad. Bad means it's not good. That's it. The service is bad. But when you want to say that the service is extremely bad and you want to put as much emotion to it, you can say atrocious. Atrocious gets the job done. It lets the listener know that something is extremely bad and extremely poor quality. Back to our question. As a non-native English speaker, why is it that you can read and write well in English, but when it's time to speak and converse in English, you freeze? And no, I'm not just talking about those times when you're in front of an interviewer, you're in a job interview, you're nervous. No, I'm not talking about those times. That's understandable. But what about those times when you're alone and you're practicing your English and you're just struggling to find the words, you're not spontaneous? You can't summon the words at will. What about those times? And the answer to that is because majority of the English words you know currently are in your passive vocabulary. They belong to your passive vocabulary, not to your active vocabulary. Sure, you might have a wide vocabulary, but how many of those words can you summon at will? How many of those words are available when you're speaking? And the key word here is speaking, because I know that by definition, passive vocabulary are words that you use when speaking and writing. But we're going to make a distinction here between speaking and writing, because when you're writing, the act itself is not that spontaneous. It doesn't require that much spontaneity. You have a few seconds, few minutes to think. But when you're speaking, it's live. You only have a few milliseconds or a few seconds at most to think about the next words to say. So going back to that sea of words, if you can read and write well in English, but you can't speak well, it means that your current active English vocabulary are not there at the top. So sure, you might know the meaning of nudge, consume, awful, enter, but you can only summon them when writing. But when it's time to speak, it's a struggle. Add to that the fact that you have a vernacular language. You're not a native English speaker. The sea of words would look like this. And the words from your vernacular language are your most active vocabulary. Sure, there might be occasional English words that become real active at the very top, but they're not enough. They're insufficient. You need more. The question is how? So, what should you do? Well, you only need to do the same thing that you did when you learned your vernacular language, and that is to expose yourself to your target language consistently. That's it. This will help you nudge those not so active vocabulary in the middle, nudge them to the surface. And the more you're exposed to them, the more you use them, the more you engage with these words, the more likely they're going to stay there at the top, at the very top, where your active vocabulary are. And the less likely that you're going to forget them. This makes for a spontaneous speech. You expose yourself consistently to a set of vocabulary, and then eventually, slowly but surely, they rise through the surface and they become as active as your vernacular language. That's it. And this is where listening comes in. Listening is a prerequisite to language learning. I talked about how important and effective listening is in this video at the top. That's my tip number 1 for learning any language for that matter. What about reading? What about writing? Are they effective at all? Do they help? And my answer to that is yes, they do. But if you're specifically struggling with spontaneity, reading and writing should be at the bottom of your priority. Because reading helps you widen your vocabulary, improves your grammar, helps you understand the context. But there is another aspect of language learning, and that is the music of the language, the melody of the language. You can't learn this from reading. No. And when I say melody of the language, I'm just making up that word. I'm specifically talking about intonation, the tone, the articulation, the stress patterns. You can't learn this when reading. Sure, when you see a comma in the middle of a sentence, you know that you're supposed to pause. Of course, you do that. But it's not as simple as that. You have to basically experience the language in its entirety. And you can only do that when you're listening. Okay, let me just pause the video and explain what I mean by that. I think that reading, writing, speaking, and listening, they're all great for engagement. They're always a step forward. They're never a step backward, which means that even if you learn a language just by reading and writing, they're still better than not doing anything at all. But when it comes to experiencing the language in its entirety as a whole, you're getting the best bang for your buck when you're listening and then speaking. Listening, while it exposes you to vocabulary, grammar, syntax, context, you're also exposed, you're also getting the feel of the intonation, tones, articulation, stress, rhythm, phrasing. And these are important if you want to learn a language with emotion, if you want to be able to express language with the appropriate emotion. Okay? That's all. That's what I mean. Bye-bye. That's why having a wide vocabulary does not necessarily mean that you're going to be able to speak spontaneously. No. Think of learning a language like learning a song. The vocabulary, the grammar, the context are the lyrics, and while the tone, the melody are the intonation, the stress patterns, the tone. These are two aspects of language that you have to experience at the same time as a whole in order to get a feel of the language. And that is what listening does for you. And another thing is when you learn the melody of the language, you're also getting the feeling of the language, the emotions behind those intonations, behind those stress patterns. And that's very important when learning a language. You don't have to focus only, you should not focus only on the grammar, on the pronunciation. You should also focus on the emotion of the language, the emotion that it creates. Your vernacular language is likely going to have a different set of melody from your target language. For example, in Filipino, when we want to say, how are you, in an expressive manner, we say, kumusta ka? Kumusta ka? But in English, you don't say, how are you? No, you say, how are you? That's different. And it's fine to speak English like that if we're just speaking among ourselves. But if you work in a call center, the need to speak in a neutral accent is strong because you're going to be encountering customers who will be demanding, oh, let me talk to an American agent. So if spontaneity is your biggest struggle, then reading and writing are the least productive use of your time. So if you graduated high school or college, chances are you have enough English words in your head. The only problem is they are dormant. They're in the middle, or worse, they're at the bottom of your sea of words. What you need to do is to nudge them to the surface so they become active. And by the way, I am not suggesting that in order for you to survive your call center life, you need to always be using descriptive words, those passive vocabulary that are at the very bottom. You don't have to use those for now to build your foundation. You're okay with the generic words, the words that you probably already learned in high school or in college. That's fine. That is your main job right now if your main struggle is spontaneity. From time to time, sure, you might want to add some descriptive words, but for now, your goal is to just build that foundation. If you can do that, you're 95% good. You will already be able to converse with native speakers with ease. While listening is definitely important and effective, it is not enough. When you listen, you have to follow it up with speaking, and that's what I'm going to talk about in my next video. I will talk about tip number 2 in learning any language. So stay tuned. But how about speaking? How does it contribute to language learning? And actually, speaking is as effective as listening. In fact, they complement each other. When you listen and you hear the language but you don't speak it, it's not as strong, it's not as effective, because through speaking, you're cementing what you learned from listening. At the same time, when you speak from what you learned by reading, not from listening, then you're not going to be able to speak well. That's for sure. So, in short, listening and speaking complement each other. One is weaker without the other. So you have to remember that is why my tip number 2 is going to be related to speaking, and that's going to be a video for another time. Once it's ready, I'm going to link it up here. So again, if your priority right now is to speak spontaneously and not freeze in the middle of the conversation because you don't know what to say, listen and then speak. Ano siya? Ay, ginoo ko, Lord. Kapuya, uy.